Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good to have you here this morning. How many of you, this is your first time to a Mixer? All right, let's welcome these folks here. You bet. So, the Mixers here, we have them on a monthly basis. The last Mixer that we had this last month was called the CEO Mixer, and we had two friends of mine, Lenny Kama, the CEO of Jack in the Box, and then Eric Grubner, the CEO of the San Diego Padres, and we talked about profit versus people. And so obviously being in that environment, right, where profit seems to continue to trump the value of people. And so we were able to walk through with them kind of how they manage and how they view the value of people, right? Especially one organization being publicly traded, and then another obviously privately held. So that was real interesting. And today we've got a great subject as we talk about workplace validation and value and where we find our self-worth. So many of us here are non-church, and you're more than welcome. We talk about the ABCs of bottom line. Is A is all are welcome. B is become part of a safe place, regardless of what you believe or don't believe. You're not judged by anything of what you believe or don't believe when you come through the door. And then finally, the C is connection, taking advantage of this community and connecting with other like-minded individuals. The goal of this community is to create a safe place for business people to connect. This isn't about posturing. This isn't about saying, gosh, look how amazing these people are up front. You should be like them. It's not at all. It's trying to take more of a little bit more of what I would call like a Jesus lifestyle approach to business, trying to have an entry point of humility, saying, hey, we don't know it all, but what we're trying to do is navigate as businessmen and women in our workplaces. So again, all are welcome. I do want to encourage you, put on your calendars December 10th. Bob Dalton is coming. He is at a TED Talk today. So Bob is getting a lot of visibility in his business. So just give you a real snippet on his business called Sackcloth and Ashes. He created Sackcloth and Ashes because his mother was homeless. And so Bob didn't come from much of anything. So I really look forward to you hearing his story. And I would say, he's definitely been given a gift, a vision. I'll do a snippet. I know he's going to share this, but just to give you an idea is he felt early on into Instagram that Instagram could be a tool for him to communicate his messaging when he just had the idea of Sackcloth and Ashes. So he had one lady, I forget the name of this one lady he had working for him. She had just made 20 blankets. Well, he had posted his first or second picture on Instagram and the story. Well, Instagram loved it so much, they wanted to put that on the Instagram story so that everyone following Instagram would see Sackcloth and Ashes. And he only had 20 blankets to sell. So anyways, it's a fun story, and Bob's got an incredible journey and just a neat, humble guy. I think Bob's 28, 29 years old, but just having a tremendous amount of success with Sackcloth and Ashes. So Sackcloth and Ashes is you buy a blanket anywhere in the world, and then you identify where you want that blanket to go to the local homeless shelter. So Subaru has got on board and other large organizations. So we're looking forward to hearing from Bob. So again, it's business with a purpose. That will be our final Mixer of the year, and it is on a Tuesday evening. So make a note of that. We won't be meeting on a Sunday, but it'll be on Tuesday evening. Real quick too, we have Invade coming up, but we're calling it Invade Workshops. I just want to give you a quick snippet. I know it's a ways away, but it's going to be a workshop. So we're going to be focusing in on digital elevation, and so how to reach your audience, measuring success, and driving higher conversion rate. We'll also have another workshop called Finance for Non-Financials, so P&L navigation, profitability, and managing expense. A third workshop called Entrepreneurship, the ABCs of starting and sustaining a business. And then finally, the creative community, working with influencers, collaborating with creatives, and finding inspiration. So trying to bring value to the business community, you'll be able to pick three of the four workshops, and it'll be a half-day event coming up in May. So just keep an eye out for more of Invade. It's called Invade Workshop. So before we introduce our guests and navigate through this conversation of value and self-worth, it's interesting, and we touched on it at the last Mixer in the West. Regardless of what areas that you come from within the world, there's somewhat of an identity crisis. So if you look at, for example, our friends in Asia, it's a shame-based society. So decision making and value is affiliated with shame. In a Western society, our identity is centered around accomplishment and accumulation. So here in the West, we equate position as value, and we equate accumulation as value as well. So we have our guest that's going to be able to walk us through when we now look into, we're going to take a sliver of that accomplishment, we're going to dive into our careers, right? Because we have our environment that's telling us this is your value. So many of us hear, hey, you're only as good as your last quarter, you're only as good as your last month, you're only as good as your last sale, you're only as good as what, right? So they affiliate whatever you did tactically as value. So Dr. Chip Taylor is going to join us. So let's welcome Dr. Chip Taylor here with us. You bet. All the way from South Carolina, bringing the bow tie all the way from the east. We don't see those very much here, Chip, but welcome.
You told me I had to.
Yeah.
Because I was going to go all Cali. I had the whole thing, like the flip-flops and the rolled-up jeans, and he said, no, you can't. You've got to go Southern. So, and you're a very handsome man, I've got to say.
Well, I do. Thank you, Chip. I appreciate that. But so many of you have wondered if
You're coming back.
Wondered who this young lady is. This is not Chip's daughter. This is Chip's wife, Erica. So Erica stands. Say hello. Yes, again.
Well played.
Yeah.
Well played.
Thank you, Chip.
Yeah, well played. So what are we doing?
So Chip.
Yes.
We're gonna. Well, first of all, something happened radically.
Yeah.
What happened yesterday?
Where is Chris? He needs to stand up. Is he around still, or is he left? Well, that's good. This is even. All right. I'm gonna. Would you mind standing up for a second? I want you to identify a fabric for me. What is the fabric? Houndstooth. And what school has houndstooth as part of their? Alabama. Alabama losing in the South is the equivalent of y'all going to Lofty and they're not having any plant-based chicken, sausage. or y'all going to Lazy Acres and everything in there has been replaced with GMO, which I learned is genetically modified organisms. We call that food. So when I get back to Charleston, there's no telling what's going to happen. It was and I'm a Tennessee fan. My daughter's middle name is, go Vols, but it's been rough. My daughter's name is double name, Southern, right? Kelly Gray, and her middle name, because she's got to have a middle name, is Neyland. And Neyland is the Tennessee football stadium. So she's named after a stadium. And the first time she figured it out, she said, "I cannot believe they named the stadium after me." And I said, "You're exactly right." So, anyway, yeah. So it's going to be a big deal going back home.
That's awesome.
It's pretty incredible. So yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Chip, for joining us. We're
Love it.
So, Chip. Obviously, one is Chip is he oversees the psychology department at the Citadel in South Carolina and Charleston, and then also has private practice. And I'm sure a lot of this you're experiencing in either both private practice or even some of the young men and women that you're counseling. But as we think of value and self-worth, right? You know that we have this challenge within, just as I teed it up, talking about organizationally. You know, walk us through that, kind of what's happening.
Yeah, what has happened is there is a incredible shift in how we value each other. And so you have folks who are going into the workplace and as you mentioned, their value is what's the next sale, what's the next quarter, et cetera. And they lose a sense of who they are. And their self-worth gets tied into that job, and that becomes problematic. And it's happened really over the last, I would say, 100 years. We were talking yesterday about how long this has been going on, and we're probably looking at 100 years of a shift in culture and how culture has, in the West, has really taken this accomplishment mentality. You've got to accomplish, you've got to make good on what you're doing. Your job defines who you are.
So walk us through that. What was happening 100 years ago that then all of a sudden we began to shift away from maybe those core values?
Yeah, if we could go back 100 years ago, um, we were a much different society. Obviously, you had more agriculture going on. So 1910, primarily agriculture. There was not a shift into industry yet. There was a more focus on God and community, and relationships were important. So people were valued because of the relationship you had with someone else, and we were more connected. You mentioned connectedness with the life groups. I mean, that really, life investment groups, that's really, really important. And we have lost that, which means folks are isolated and insulated from each other. And I think there was a less of a facade of putting on the face of corporate world and trying to be someone maybe they're not on the inside and the outside.
You brought up a good point the other day in our conversation when you said there was also a shift in schooling.
Yeah.
So you went from education of being more of a learning center to then focusing on industry. Maybe walk us through that a little bit.
I would love to. This is, if you want to look up something interesting, there's a guy named Sir Ken Robinson, and he is an Englishman who talks about the changing education paradigm and how schools have changed the way we think about things. And a lot of my work, I work with a lot of, it's shifted. I work with a lot of college-age kids, primarily boys, and they go off to college and they really don't have an understanding of anything except for this lockstep approach to grades and accomplishment. And so they get away from home and away from that environment where the relationships are there and they have no way of doing it. I think this comes out of the industry mindset of school. So if you look at school, and this again, this is Ken Robinson stuff. You look at school. School's set up in a situation where you've got classrooms, you've got bells. It's very industry driven, and everything is accomplishment based. You've got to make an A to be valued. You get stickers, etc. That was a shift. In 1910, you had about 50% of the folks going to school, and they went to 8th grade. So the schools have driven this purpose and accomplishment piece so hard, and then you add on standardized testing. So we're creating an environment, a culture, where from the time you're 6 years old, it's about achievement. And you graduate, and it's about achievement. And then you go to the next level, and it's about achievement. And so when you get to the position where either you're not able to achieve because the circumstances change, they fall apart. They have a really hard time because they've lost their self-worth.
It's interesting, too, that the shift happened in the early 1900s, right, about centered around achievement. But
Right.
what's, I think, also interesting is then you had to center saying, well, how can we monetize this? And we saw after World War II that strategically we began to shift as an economy that focused less on exporting and really focused more on accumulation. So if you remember, obviously 9/11 was horrific, but
Right.
if you remember President George Bush, regardless of whatever side that you're on, one of the first things he said was, get out and shop.
Yeah.
So again,
Right.
is we focused on that accumulation post-World War II that went side by side with accomplishment that began in education.
Yeah, and we tie ourselves to the value of the material things that we've got, and our self-worth, what makes us happy is what we have in our houses, what we have in our closets. I mean, I went to, because you told me I couldn't go Cali, I had to go to DAV yesterday. I like DAV. So I walked into DAV and I got this wonderful shirt, which was great for $8. But you walk in there and you look at all of the stuff that people have discarded, just the amount and amount and amount of stuff. And part of that is we buy into the belief that if we have accumulated wealth, material wealth, then we've arrived. We're successful. We are in a position of power because we have the accumulation of things. And it's not a California thing, it's not a Southern thing, it's a Western culture event.
So here we are, and work takes up a good part of our week, right? So 75, 80%. We're really driven towards accomplishment. We're rewarded in that environment based upon how we are producing, right? So, which is all, it's good, right? But
It's
when does it become maybe unhealthy,
Yeah,
right?
it's good in balance. The balance is you've got to be able to understand that what you're doing doesn't define who you are. I mean, I appreciate you didn't ask about the job until he shared his job with you in the sharing that happened earlier on. The accumulation and the success rate that happens because of your job, if you think about it, if that becomes who you are and that goes away, then what's left? And you wind up that's when it becomes dangerous, when it starts to define your every existence. When you're more concerned about your Instagram post, and you all should get 400, but if you're more concerned about the Instagram post than you are about the content and the context and the relationship of the person sitting beside you. If the first thing I say is I'm a clinical psychologist, that's not good, because that means it's running my life and it's gotten out of balance. And it's gotten out of balance because that's where I get the positive reinforcement. I mean, we talk about reinforcers. What drives behavior? The things that drive behavior typically are the things that hurt us, negative consequences, are the things that reward us, positive reinforcers. So the positive reinforcers are all the things that happen when I go to work. If I teach a class and I do a good job, if I leave here and you take me to lunch and buy me something really good, right? Which I hope you will, and not kombucha, something that's not something that's not.
Okay, why don't you share with our audience what is good? So as you think of a place that you would choose
To go?
to go when you're back home, just to give them a snippet of your diet.
Oh. Have you heard of Bojangles? Okay. So if I'm in Charleston and I want to reward myself for doing something good at work, right?
Right.
I will get in the truck and I'll go to Bojangles. It's what's their slogan? I see it's so good I don't even know their slogan. It's something about fried chicken and biscuits. That's what it is. Country ham biscuit, well done on a dark brown biscuit with a lemonade with a sweet tea with 3 lemons and an order of Bo Rounds, and maybe some strawberry jelly on the side to go on the biscuit. Yeah, it's good stuff. And guess what? It's GMO. So good. So good. Yeah, but seriously, when my job defines me,
Yeah.
when my every waking moment is about the job, then that becomes a problem. I think the other thing that's a problem is with the accumulation of wealth. If my paycheck is spent before I make it, then I get into this rat race. It's an indentured servitude. You've got to make the money to pay the bill. And so then it totally defines who you are, because the time that you might tap the brakes and enjoy relationships, you can't do it because of everything else that's going on. You've got to make sure that you make that payment. And we have a problem with credit debt. We have a problem with buying before we have made the money. And that ties us into this idea that we've got to do something to make it or we're a failure.
So it's what we could say is it's a bit of a myth.
Totally a myth.
So let's kind of walk down that pathway. So
Yeah.
let's say, as we buy into this idea that it is about accomplishment, and you've heard us talk about here at Bottom Line that it's interesting when we introduce ourselves, right? And we say, oh, I'm Jeff, you're Chip. What do we say? What do you
do?
What do you do, right? It's not, which doesn't necessarily have any reflection of truly the person you are. It's just something that you do in order to, provide for your family and so forth. But that's what we go to. And you've heard, the internal discussions that we have. You're only as good as such and such. So we've bought into this myth, with which, if we bought into it, then there's probably feelings of being devalued to some degree.
Yeah, totally. You buy into it, and you lose who you are. And as you lose who you are because of what you're trying to accomplish to meet the myth and not slay the dragon, you wind up being in a position where you can't rest. And so you have constant stress. and you have constant situations where you become depressed if you're not able to accomplish those goals. You know, in entropy, the law of entropy states that things will become disordered. So no matter how hard we work, no matter how much we try to get something done, it's going to fall apart. And when it falls apart, if you haven't maintained your essence of who you are, then, and you bought into this myth, then you're going to be in a position of really having some significant mental health issues and falling into some of the traps that we all fall into to get the reinforcement that we need from outside sources.
So how are we filling? So walk us through that. What are some of the things that we might fill that void in?
Yeah. Some of the things are, it gets back to the credit cards and the purchases. It's the stuff mart. You know, Jeff said I couldn't use this analogy or this story because no one would understand it, but I'm going to just go out on a limb here. Y'all know what the VeggieTales are?
I'm sorry.
Mic drop. Mic drop. Say I knew. All right, Madam Blueberry. Madam Blueberry. I can sing the song too, right? Yeah. Yeah. Madam Blueberry went to the stuff mart and stuffed her treehouse with stuff. And what happened? Treehouse fell down, right? So she learned that happiness is not from stuff. So one of the things, I am so glad that worked out. You are so going to hear from me. God, that's great.
I'm going to find the most vegan place after this to take you to. And it's going to be trippy.
Trippy.
So you get ready.
Yeah. Whatever trippy means. Vegan.
Does anybody have access to the Swami's temple that I can get?
So one of the things that we do to fill the void is we do retail therapy, right? We find our value in the things that we purchase. We find our value in our cars. We found our value in the renovations we're doing on our house. I'm sorry, I had to bring it just because you've changed the design like 3 times. and guess what? She'll win, and we'll do it the way she wants to do it. But we do those things, and the danger of that is we wind up still getting in this kind of mess, because if you do retail therapy and you have the Amazon coming and you're clicking, one, you're not addressing the problem.
Yeah.
And 2, you're still accumulating debt, which keeps you in this circle. That's one.
Yeah.
Pornography is an escape, totally an escape. We talk about it all the time. If I could pull back the veil of my practice and say to you not every, but I'm going to say every. When those teenage boys come in to see me, or those college-age kids come in to see me, and I say, tell me how much you're looking at porn, they don't look at me with big eyes like, how could you ask me that? They give me a frequency and tell me what their favorite website is. That's their escape. It's a distraction. Okay? Alcohol. You come home, you've had a bad day, you get your bourbon. You pour your bourbon, you sit down, and you decompress. That's not real, right? That's not going to last. It winds up making you have to do something about this.
You talked about self-loathing.
Self-loathing.
As well.
Yeah. You get to the point where you continue in those patterns, and those patterns are not going to keep you going. And so then you start feeling bad about yourself and about your existence because, 1, you're not being successful at work. 2, you're doing things that are keeping you in this trap. And 3, you're doing things that are detrimental to your relationships that you have, your inner circle. And as a result of that, you start having these negative cognitions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think of 2 men in particular, displaced anger. Obviously, that's a big one.
Oh, yeah. So y'all know what displaced anger is? Displaced anger is I've had a bad day at work, and I come home, and my kid has done something that is minor, and I blow up. So it's a projection. It's a defense mechanism that we have. It's a projection. So I act in a way that's disproportional to the event because I am bringing what's happened outside into the room. Does that make sense? Yeah. So particularly with men, I think that we're really good at doing that, good in quotation marks. We come home and we're upset about something else, and we displace the anger onto our loved ones because they're safe. Well, how sick and perverted is that? Like, I'm going to be mean to someone that I love because they're the safe people to be mean, but because they'll forgive me, right? So that's a problem. And men, particularly when they get depressed with that self-loathing, they become much more aggressive, stereotypically, 30,000 feet, than do females. Females tend to do what you would stereotypically think about as depression, right? Sadness, tearfulness, negativity in that regard. Guys act out. Guys and teenage boys act out.
So here we are. We're talking about value, self-worth in our career, right?
This alkaline
so we
water,
know
this is incredible.
it's good stuff.
I mean, it's tap water, but y'all call it alkaline. So
Yeah.
it's,
So we look at the history, right?
$5 a
of
bottle.
back over here, Chip. So
I'm-
we look at the history of where we're finding value and we're finding self-worth going all the way back to early 1900s. It then the educational shift around performance, right? Going from learning to then centered around industry. Then an economy shift going from exporting to accumulation and purchases, right? So we have all this radical shift that is now telling us what is of value, how you're defined as being valuable through accomplishment as well as accumulation. So we're in this cycle, and the cycle really is called hurry sickness, right? So when we think of hurry sickness, it's basically a behavioral pattern. It's characterized by continued rushing and anxiousness.
Look at you being all clinical.
So-
That was good. Say that
Thanks,
again.
buddy.
That was nice.
Thanks, buddy.
Yeah.
Anyways, so we go on. So we're in this kind of hurry sickness. So what's the answer? You brought up something, I think it was called stages of change.
Right. Well, I think first we got to spend a little bit of time, if we got it, on hurry sickness. We have time for that?
Yeah.
All right. So how many of you all have had to check your phone a couple times while I've been in here? Honesty, candor. Anything really important happen? Nothing? What? Something? Something. So, huh? Okay, something with the kids. You okay? Need to go? All right, good. So we've got this connectivity, right? And so we never ever tap the brakes, ever. First thing you do in the morning used to be pee. Now it's check your phone. Right? First thing you do at night used to be tell somebody you love them good night. Now it's check your phone. So we're in this, it is a perpetual own cycle. And you talked about work-life balance. I don't know how you find work-life balance when we're connected because of Steve Jobs to the entire world. I knew when I landed in San Diego, the minute the wheels touched the ground, that my kid in Charleston, who has just learned how to drive, had screwed up his tire and driven 14 miles on a flat. The tire looked phenomenal, right? But I knew it immediately. So there's never a chance to stop. And so the hurry sickness, what happens is you get into that pattern, you think it's life. Like we equate being busy with productivity and self-worth. And that's a lie. That's part of the myth. If we think that being busy means that we're doing well, then that's a problem. And so it causes, the cardiologist came up with a term. It leads to cortisol increases. It leads to health issues. It leads to sleeplessness. All kinds of detrimental effects because we never, ever slow down. And then when you have a chance to slow down, how many of y'all go on vacation with like once a year? How many days does it take you to settle down? By the time you come back, right? Right. So Jeff asked me the other night if I was a dimmer or a switch. And I am typically a dimmer. It takes me a long time to come down and be able to tap the brakes. And breathe. And about the time you breathe, your phone dings and there's something you got to deal with and you're back in the rhythm. So that's the hurry sickness. We're never at peace.
Yeah. So let's talk about what's the answer, right?
Yeah.
So here
Yeah.
we are, we're in this hurry sickness. We bought into this idea of where value comes from.
Yeah, and
What's
that-
the answer?
And that gets to the stages of change. So I'll do this relatively quickly. To change a behavior, something's got to happen. People don't just change their behaviors. You've got to have some kind of event that happens to drive the change. We have pre-contemplation. You don't think there's a problem at all. You have contemplation. You think there's a problem, but you're not really ready to do something about it. You have action. Action is when you start taking the steps to change. You have maintenance. Maintenance is when you've done it for a while and you're used to it and it's become part of who you are. And then you have relapse when you slip. So in order for us to get to understand hurry sickness and get away from it, we've got to first recognize it as real and it's got to impact us.
That's right.
It's got to impact us. You've got to realize that it's significant enough in your life that you're willing to make the changes that you've got to make in your profession to get away from it. It's got to be intentional.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And then you brought up 4 steps to take, right? I think you started with kind of the idea of this cognitive shift. Walk us through that.
Yeah, and the cognitive shift is it's when you take a look at your world and you ask yourself the question. And it's Dr. Philish. How's this going for you, bud? Right? I mean, I hate to bring in Dr. Phil, but he's got more money than I've got, which means he's successful, right?
Yeah.
That means he's successful, right? So how's that going for you, bud? You take stock of how you're doing. How are your relationships? If you took the job away, if you took the occupation away, what's left? And if the what's left is scary to you, then you've got to make a cognitive shift. You've got to think about what you're doing differently because there's a dissonance there. There's a dissonance between what you think you want and what you need. And so when you figure out, you ask the question. That's the first step.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you were talking about as well the other day, so it's not trying to capture everything, but making incremental shifts.
Yeah, low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. So the second thing that you said, kind of this idea begin to focus in on true value is to be intentional. Maybe walk us through that.
Yeah, so intentionality gets to, you're going to make, once you decide that you're going to do something different, you've got to be intentional in that pursuit. You've got to be intentional in how you structure your days. You've got to be intentional about your relationships. You've got to be intentional about your inner circle so that you're not isolated. You get into a position where you are making little shifts in day-to-day operations that lead over time to a change. Now, in your case, as we said the other day, your shift was pretty radical and gnarly.
Right.
Did you like that? Radical and gnarly? Yeah,
like that.
yeah. Come. And what was the other thing you said about the Sharma place? It was
Trippy?
Trippy. It was trippy too.
You don't even know what that means.
I come back with more adjectives. I go back to class and say, "Y'all, this is trippy," and they'll fire me. I'll lose tenure immediately. All right, so yours was pretty gnarly, but most people make shifts that are smaller. Like I talk about with patients, you don't make radical shifts where you go across the buoys. You don't go across the channel. You stay in between the navigational beacons and you make course corrections. So that's the intentional piece. I am going to intentionally change some things to make it work.
So it first starts with kind of a cognitive shift.
Right.
Really to step back and say, how is this working for me, right? And
Right.
really being transparent with myself and identifying, you know what, no, I need to make a change. The second point then is to be intentional, right? And so I think you talked about the low-hanging fruit. So if you have certain vices, really focusing in on, hey, where can I start eliminating those vices as well as
Accountability.
accountability. That's
You've
right.
got to have accountability. I can't do it by myself.
Yeah, that's right.
There's no way. So if I'm in a pattern, ruts, and routines, and I'm doing something, and I've decided I'm going to change it, there's no way I can change that on my own.
Yeah.
Even if something catastrophic happens, it's going to be hard to change it on your own.
I think too, you and I are chatting about, I think there's a misconception, the difference between isolation and just kind of quiet, right, and solitude.
Yeah.
So I think when you're thinking of, gosh, I'm grinding Monday through Friday, I need all day Saturday by myself, that's isolation.
Yeah.
So maybe walk us through kind of isolation versus solitude.
Okay. So isolation is, boy, you tee me up well. This is like Pat Sajak and Vanna White. I mean, I'll just say, and who's who, right? Who's who? Isolation happens when you come home after working all week, working a 70-hour week. You come home, you've got Saturday, you get up, and all you do is unplug from the world. And what we know clinically is that equates to basically ostracizing yourself. You're ostracizing yourself from everyone else. And there are two things that are buzzwords in psychology, ostracism and bullying. Of the two, being ostracized is worse than being bullied because you are totally not engaged with anybody in any type of relationship. So when you come home and you unplug and you do that and you shut that door, then because you've got to, right, I've got to recharge, I've got to be by myself, I've got to have some me time. Me time is not quiet time. Me time is not what we need to do to rekindle our souls.
Yeah, that's good. You know, it was interesting. About 5 years ago, I was thinking of someone who said, you know what, I'm going to live intentionally. And so 5 years ago, there was some executives. We had a meeting, and we had the privilege of meeting Robert Redford. And we had a conversation with Robert Redford, and his focus was, I want to live intentionally. And so many of us know Robert Redford, the actor. Then he created Sundance Films. But he said, I choose not to have a cell phone or a computer because of what I do. And so what I do is I'm a storyteller. So what I do is I don't have a cell phone, don't have a computer, and I usually go to parks and I'll sit and I watch people. And so that intentionality allows me to have creative thought process and then come up with creative ideas versus I know that the phone, I know that the computer are massive distraction, if not a major barrier to where I want to get to as a creative.
Yeah, and it's what I think clinically. This is a qualitative, subjective statement. I think our youth, our kids, are going to wind up living a life where they don't understand anything beyond that computer and technology, and they live a life of anxiety because of fear of missing out.
Mm-hmm.
They're so anxious about what's happening in that world that they don't understand how to interact with other people. So those of you who have kids in your workplace that you're mentoring, mentor them to unplug to some extent.
Yeah.
I say that as I've got my phone up here checking my notes, right? So we're all bad about it, but it is a critical thing to touch base on.
Okay.
Yep.
So the first 2 points you talk about is getting out of this hurry sickness, getting out of this value affiliated with what I do, is that cognitive shift, asking myself the question, hey, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Second point you said is being intentional. And the third point you talked about was self-control. So that purposely slow down and really, in essence, even avoid shaming yourself through that process.
Right.
Maybe walk us through that self-control.
Well, because the self-control thing, if I start changing what I'm doing and I'm starting to do things that are more purposeful and intentional to unplug and to be thoughtful about what my value is, what's going to happen to the people who I've been interacting with, right? Any system that changes, something changes with it. The people who I'm interacting with, my boss, my employees, et cetera, are going to see something different, and they may not like it, right? So you're going to have to deal with the ramifications of the shift that happens in your life relative to the people who are interacting with you, not your core group, not your life investment group, but the folks who are outside of that, who are your day-to-day folks. They're not going to like the change. When people change, other people don't like it typically because it disrupts them.
That's right.
Right? So that's the first thing. And then I think as we go through this, you've got to have enough self-control to understand that you are going to go through these stages. You're going to have struggles. You've got to maintain some balance. And then when you slip up, you don't beat yourself up because your life's going to change. Right. You're going to leave the corporate world. I mean, this is a classic. You're going to leave the corporate world, and you've told me many times. How many folks have called you since you left?
Zero.
Zero.
Yeah.
Zero.
Yeah.
I'll call you, but I didn't know you from that life.
No.
Right?
No. My corporate.
Your
my
corporate
friends.
right. Because you've changed, right? So your value has changed. So then what are you likely to start doing? Self-loathing. And that's the trap, because that means you're still clinging to the myth.
Yeah.
It's a silly analogy. It just came to mind. I've got a patient right now who just had a brain tumor removed. And they removed a 22-year-old kid. They removed a substantial chunk of it, 90% of it. But there's a 10% piece that's still clinging to the hypothalamus. That's the piece they're going to have to worry about, right? When you make a change and you resect that tumor that you've been dealing with in your life, the 10% that's there is what you're going to self-loathe about because it's going to keep manifesting itself, and you got to watch it. and be mindful of that and surround yourself with people who are core people who have like-minded values so that when you're attacked by others, you're okay with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to get out of this sickness, it's cognitive shift, it's being intentional, self-controlled, and finally is valuing community. So maybe walk through that. What does that mean to value community?
Value community means that you recognize that your quiet time is important, but what's as important, if not more important, is connecting with other people and doing things that are intentional to lift up other people. It's very hard for me to be selfish and looking inward at what I've got to do in my punch list, my to-do list, if I am involved with other people. And the problem with this statement is my wife is here, so once I say this, I will be drug into many more social opportunities and obligations, right?
Opportunity, keyword right there. Opportunity.
Obligations, right? So for lots of us, that's a very hard thing to do. And what we do is we complain about it on the way. Guys, I don't really want to go do this. I don't want to go do this. Why are we having to do this? I'm tired. We get there and we plug into people and we're energized because we're relational. We are relational beings. And then we leave and we think, God, that was great. But it's hard to do because it goes against the myth.
Yeah.
I think what it does for you, the clinical term is behavioral activation. What it does for you, for someone who's depressed or getting down, not necessarily clinically depressed, is it plugs them into somebody else and allows them to pour into someone else, and that lifts them. All the boats are raised.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So really the idea then is we kind of come to a close is as we're buying into this Western idea that many of us have bought into, I've been guilty of buying into it as well, is that my value is coming from accomplishment and then I show my accomplishment through accumulation. If I find myself in that kind of hamster wheel, which is called what we reference as hurry sickness, right? The 4 steps really we're talking about is that cognitive shift,
Asking the question.
asking the question,
Yep.
hey, how's it going?
Right.
Then there's the idea of being intentional, both between like what you said is first go after the low-hanging fruit that you can just kind of cut out, right? Being intentional that maybe if Amazon Prime is my fix, I kind of shut that off for a moment.
Right.
If my social media is my fix, if whatever alcohol, whatever my fix is, right? Go after that low-hanging fruit. Then you talked about self-control, right? Is just purposely slowing down, not to isolate, but to find quiet and solitude. And then the final point you talked about was the value of community. So whether you're introverted who maybe use that as, well, I'm introverted, so therefore, or I'm extroverted and I'm just burned out
Or
by the end of the week. So
the
there's
one I
always-
use. I mean, the one I use is I do this all the time, talk to people. Why do I want to go talk to people? Why do
Yeah.
I want to go do this right now?
Yeah.
I do this all week. Well, it's different.
Right.
That's a cop-out.
Right.
And
So-
I know I said it, so it's taped, so you're good. You're good.
So really just finding the value of community. So keeping that in mind. So it's almost this counterintuitive idea of finding community because that's going to bring a lot more and greater value in my human makeup than, let's say, something else that I want to push the button on. Or
Yeah, and I think the thing that we miss in this conversation is we think it's counterintuitive, but what it's going to do, it's going to increase your business. It's going to increase your productivity. It's going to make you a better employer, a better employee. It's going to make you a better person.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's give it up for Dr. Chip Taylor. You bet. Thanks, buddy. Chip, please sit down. Thanks. No, we'll have Chip back up.
Are you in a hurry? You in a hurry?
What's that?
You in a hurry?
Can you turn this microphone off, please? No, we'll have Chip up at the end. So for those of you that are interested in connecting with him, please feel free to come. It's interesting. I was thinking about, I don't know how many of you have read the Steve Jobs book, but it's interesting that he references, like we think of Steve Jobs, right, Apple, all the success and so forth, but it was at the end of his life, knowing that he was going to die, when he said, you know what, I wish I would have taken my daughter on vacation. He went right to the relational. So it's interesting when we have death on the doorstep and we have a reality check of how I live my life. Now, we would all, as business people, go, man, tremendous success, right? We all have a representation of Steve Jobs in our lap or on our back pocket or in our purse. But yet, even the great Steve Jobs recognized that, you know what, I fell short relationally. There's a book by William, I forget his last name. The book's called A Guide to the Good Life. I forget his name, his last name. I apologize. But I love what he wrote in this area. William Irvine, that's who it is. That's right, William Irvine. He talks about misliving in his book, A Guide to the Good Life. And he says, there's a danger that you mislive, that despite all your activity, despite all the pleasant diversions you might have enjoyed while you were alive, you will end up living a bad life. There is, in other words, a danger that when you are on the deathbed, you will look back and realize that you wasted your chance at living. Instead of spending your life pursuing something genuinely valuable, like relationships, you squandered it because you allowed yourself to be distracted by the various baubles life has to offer. Interesting. And I even love, Jesus himself said, he said, come to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The reason that Jesus referenced yoke was because that was a reference in biblical times of the religious people that we're talking about where true value comes from. And it was these heavy, heavy burdens for people to find value that they had to do life a certain way. Isn't that interesting, right? We don't call it yoke today, but we call it accomplishment and we call it accumulation. But Jesus says, no, man. There's a different way. There's a different way. The miracle of Christianity is not necessarily abiding by the rules and the principles. I think sometimes there's a misconception of Christianity. Like if I convert to this faith, I have to do this and don't do that and do this and don't do that. When in actuality, Christianity begins with faith. It's that step of faith. So do I trust Jesus today when he says, come to me. I'll give you a different value system. Come to me. You know, I'm not gonna accuse you. I'm not gonna shame you. Maybe kind of in the world that you're in right now. Come to me. You're accepted. Come to me. You know, life is good. I'm gentle. Come to me. And that's the step of faith. So as we go on to our business lives tomorrow, are we willing to take that step of faith and go, man, whew, I got to revisit some choices that I'm making right now and get off this hamster wheel that's driving hurry sickness in my life. Great insight from Dr. Taylor, but even greater insight from Jesus himself that said, hey, man, you willing to trust? Give me a shot. Lord Jesus, thank you for today. Thank you for a new day. God, the Bible says that your promises are new every morning and for everyone. So thank you. Thank you that you're gentle with us. God, many of us here, some of us here, we don't follow the Christian faith, and we're on a journey, and that's okay. But God, we pray you show up and make your gentleness known to us as we begin a new week. In Christ's name, amen.